Afternoon all. There was an amazing game just played in round 7 of the Gashimov Memorial. Hikaru Nakamura playing white against Magnus Carlsen. Nakamura's record, as most people know, is pretty bad against Magnus. He has not beaten him in classical time control. I think before this game it's actually 9-0, the score between them. Of course there was a very close one just not too long ago where Naka was completely winning and managed to lose, which didn't help. But let's see what happened in this game. So d4 from Naka, and Magnus plays knight f6 onto c4 e6. So are we going to get a Nimzo-Indian or a Queen's Indian? Thankfully we get a Nimzo-Indian. I find this slightly more interesting, allowing the pin. And now f3 was played. So this is a very interesting move against Nimzo-Indian. Magnus now played c5. d5 has been played a lot as well, but c5 is a very interesting pawn structure. It's reminiscent to me of the Benoni defense, what we're about to get with this pawn structure, with black about to play soon after e4 d6. This after e takes c takes would be a Benoni pawn structure, but in a modern Benoni the bishop's fianchettoed over here. So what's the difference? Well, there are some perks of such a structure. Black usually has a queenside pawn majority in the Benoni and pressure along the e-file and dark squares generally. White actually preserves his structure now with bishop d2 in case the bishop takes c3. After knight bd7, he's offering white d takes. I think that's pretty harmless. In fact, black might be doing absolutely fine if d takes. So f takes. Black's just got a nice position, can maybe use the f4 square with greater emphasis later. So I think that's not a big deal. So white played knight ge2, and then we see knight e5 here. And already, I kind of like black's position. This structure is kind of exciting on the dark squares. Knight g3 was played protecting the c4 pawn. Now e takes, c takes. So we've got this classic Benoni pawn structure with the bishop outside instead of fianchettoed. We see now bishop d7. After the game, Magnus expressed this might be a slight mistake because that would have been useful for a knight. It looks like a natural move in some respects. If black wants to get on with his queenside pawn majority, say c4 and being able to play rook c8 later. a3, and the bishop doesn't really want to give itself up here, just bishop a5. It can be useful after b5 on this diagonal. Once this b5 is prepared, that would be a very useful diagonal for the bishop. We see in fact after bishop e2, and now the move b5 is played. So if we just quickly examine knight takes, this doesn't work too well. Bishop takes. In this position, apparently black's doing fine with rook b8. There'll be enough play here for black after a6. See, this is actually very nice for black. So white has to tread carefully here in this sort of position. So white doesn't really want to take this. It will give black too much counterplay, it seems. So it's just ignored by Nakamura by playing. He just castled here. The engine actually suggests something very interesting. b4 instead of casting. Sorry, if b4 takes, and if black takes, knight takes b5. Now this works a little bit better, but still only just about equal. So okay. White castled, and then we see c4, and it looks, personally I like black's position. I've got a bias towards it. It looks like very pleasant for the queenside pawn majority and the dark square control, but black does have to worry about being thumped later with a central flooding, with f4 e5 or f5 f6 later, because this bishop's not over here, so black could be more vulnerable on the king side. There's a very classic game where one of Britain's finest masters, Jonathan Penrose, beat the legend Mikhail Tal in the Olympiad in a Benoni, and with such a play getting a very strong attack. So black needs to be very careful. Although the queenside pawn majority, this mechanism at f4 is very dangerous, either for e5 or f5 later. We see bishop e3 and then bishop b6, queen d2, and now black plays rook b8. That would really ideally like to try and move these pawns, but you've got to be careful if they're going to be weak or not later. At the moment, with this bishop pins, black's restraining white's kingside attack, and any f4 here. I think knight can just go to g6, and that should be safe enough right now at the moment. Okay, although f4 is prompted as one of the better moves immediately instead of what Necker played. That's interesting. f4 does seem quite logical in some respects. If knight g4, then actually white has bishop d4 here, so that helps justify this. It looks to be quite okay, very pleasant actually for white here. So maybe that's an interesting test, but instead we see knight d1. So it seems a little bit on the passive side potentially, but okay, bishop c8, giving d7 to the knight if needed. King h1, so starting to prepare f4. Now Magnus actually plays knight fd7, so these knights can try and use the d3 square potentially, or like this anyway. So after f4 now we see knight g6, but it's one's got to be careful about f5 and f6 all the time. At the moment f5 is not doing too much without any f6 support. I think after f5 the knight can just pop back here, and if f6, I think this can just be taken without penalty. Any bishop g5, I think this is okay. It's not a problem at the moment. You might think it's a problem, but it doesn't seem to be. So actually Necker took on b6, and we see rook takes b6. So this 3-2 is potentially dangerous all the time, especially in endgames. We see knight e3, and this f5 square also looks a bit dangerous from white's perspective. Knight can come to f5 or h5, and this could be dangerous on g7. There's also resources like this to be wary of. So it looks a little bit scary for black as well. So knight c5 was played. So knight b3 is on the cards actually here to fork queen and rook. Bishop d1 stops that. Now knight steps into d3. But now, without that knight controlling f6, f5, f6 seems more menacing. And in fact, after f5 here, Magnus is on the back foot a little bit. If he does play knight g e5, it seems f6. This is terrifying now for black's king safety, this particular position. For example, if taking knight h5, all white needs to do is take it here to let his queen come in for the kill. This seems extremely diabolical. Say a6 as an example. If black doesn't want to give up the exchange, this sort of thing is just devastating. So Magnus, in light of f6 being so dangerous, actually plays this. It seems a bit odd, but both knights support each other at the moment, and they block against the effectiveness, the full force of f6. It's not so dangerous here. In fact, I think the queen can just take here. Queen takes f6. There's no real penalty. If knight h5, queen e5, there's no real penalty there at all with f6 now after knight g f4. Now white tries to play a bit on the queen side to undermine the structure a little bit. So the perk of the knight here is looking at c4, and this rook here looks fairly logical for these two pieces to play a4, try and undermine this structure. a6. Now we see knight g4, so threatening rook takes f4. Black has to do something quite radical here actually against this. And what can actually black do? He doesn't really want to allow rook takes f4. Say this to try and win something over here. This is not very good. White's attack could continue here with f6, and it looks pretty terrible. So Magnus has to find something radical. g5 looks totally out of the question. Say knight e2. This looks much better for white. This just looks horrendous for black. What he plays actually, Magnus actually plays, is h5, counter-attacking the knight on g4. So it's like white was nearly going to punch back Kingside a bit with f6, but it's just in time kind of defense. It seems adequate enough to turn it into a kind of positional pawn sacrifice. If rook takes f4 here, then after h takes, rook takes, the rook's slightly misplaced actually, even though it seems to be threatening tactically knight h5. Positioning it's a little bit misplaced, and a move like knight e5 doesn't give white much time to do anything. Say rook g5, this is just black can start working on the queenside pressure and without getting mated, so black would actually be better here. So this doesn't look like anything for white here, this position. Although the engine is suggesting a5 could be a nuisance. If here, okay, this is a slight improvement, I guess, where white's won a pawn and black doesn't have too much counterplay, it seems to speak of. So maybe that's a little nuance to not allow any big b takes a4 stuff. That's a little nuance there. Knight takes, a takes. This again is better for white. Okay, so maybe a slight inaccuracy for how white could have played it there. Maybe this rook takes f4. There's some mileage in it. The engines are actually suggesting it is the strongest move here to play. Well, one of the strongest moves. Pardon me. At depth 18, it's changing its mind now between knight f2 and rook f4 quite frequently. At depth 19, rook takes f4. So there's a hard choice between knight f2 and rook takes f4. But it seems in conjunction with this a5 idea, I think that's key to making rook takes f4 work, to try and stymie black's counterplay. But Naka chose knight f2, and I think he already felt he'd sort of blown it a little bit here, because of this quite powerful idea that the black queen can kind of use the dark squares. Queen f6 to h6. In the Benoni, you'd have a pawn on g6. This kind of stuff would be impossible. But here the queen can freely glide on dark squares and attack dark squares and do things like this. So I guess that's the advantage of not having these pawns moved yet. So this position here now, it seems personally to me, okay, black can lose a pawn, but the fundamental thing has not changed. The 3-2 pawn majority has not changed, and if black can just coordinate pieces better after that than white, then the pawn majority is going to be very, very dangerous. That's my sincerest opinion of this position, objectively, from a human point of view. So white can try and win a pawn here with just knight takes h5. Say knight takes. Now here bishop takes is an inaccuracy because of queen takes b2, and black's actually doing amazingly well there. But white can play knight takes d3, and this changes actually the pawn majority situation. So c takes, and I think this echoes what we've just seen before. If bishop takes h5, then b takes and black's better, got queenside counterplay. But white inserts this a5 here, and again is better. So it just removes this queenside counterplay from black. and now taking on h5, and this looks like a solid pawn up without too many concerns on the queenside pawn majority front, or black's queenside pressure on b2. So yeah, this a5 nuance is very, very important, it seems, in these variations. So I think this is unfortunately, yeah, Naka didn't go for that. So yeah, it does seem as though knight takes h5. That's a very clever idea. Is okay. What else could black actually do here? If queen takes b2, looks like a disaster. Queen takes, knight takes f4, losing the knight for nothing. So yeah, that seems to be an opportunity, but it needs the accurate follow-up of a5 to work. So Necker actually played knight takes d3 instead, and here, after knight takes d3, it seems tempting to take the pawn, but then the b2 would drop. Let's have a quick look. Knight takes h5, queen takes b2, and the thing is, queen g5 looks as though it's going to deliver a knockout punch, but black has a move here which is very, very powerful and seemingly adequate, just getting this nasty pin on the f pawn, queen e5, and black's actually technically better here. It's going to follow through with knight c5 and hit e4. What can white do? If white tries to arrange an attack, well, he's going to drop the rook here, and d1, there's no time for that. If rook b1, rook b7, and f6 is on the cards, that's the key thing. The attack's not going to go anywhere, because once the rook's protecting g7, f6 becomes possible without the queen not protecting g7. So this would be fine for black. So that really seemed dangerous. It's not doing anything. Knight takes h5, it seems. Not doing anything much anyway. So Necker actually played queen e3, hitting the rook. And now, interestingly, black has a technical resource in h4, the engine points out. So offering the rook here, h takes, this is quite dangerous. Dangerous stuff going on. If here, queen takes, and apparently black's fine here, it's got enough compensation. Queen can slip back to e5, this looks pretty good for black. And this pawn majority looks pretty dangerous. But yeah, that's a very interesting resource, h4. But Magnus is human. He played just move the rook. He moved the rook. He doesn't mind losing the pawn here, because now he can try and emphasize the pawn majority. So knight takes h5 was taken. He basically emphasizes the pawn majority by going into getting the queens off here. If white denies the queens coming off, well, if the queen doesn't, say the queen moves here, all the time there's b takes a4. That's a real pain for rook takes b2 later. So not much time has been given to white other than to take the queen here. Queen d4 might be a try though, apparently. Takes rook a3 here. So if rook takes b2, there's rook takes d3. So quick look. Rook takes d3. And if knight takes b2, I think this would be far too dangerous for king safety. Surely rook g3. We're looking at g7. That's very interesting and very dangerous for black. I think Magnus would have a hard time here. So yeah, it does seem queen d4 might be palatable against this b takes a4. So it's not always working amazingly well. I don't know if it's about equal if black doesn't take on b2 with f6 apparently. Complex, a very complex position, but no, white just took the queens off, and yeah, now we've got this situation where you might think, well, can this 3-2 be stabilized here? If we try a5, I'm not entirely sure this helps. Well, knight takes b2 for a start is immediately on. White doesn't really want to allow this. This is looking as though there's not much attacking energy without the queens on. So Nakamura actually took on b5 after a takes, plays bishop c2. He said in the game at this point he started moving pieces to the wrong places quite frequently from about here, or from after the queens came off. So what would be a good configuration for white against this 2-to-1 pawn majority? Well, maybe just rook b1, and say black goes forward, bishop e2, and what does black want to do? Say knight e5 here. The pawns could actually be quite weak potentially. This should be totally okay for white. White can actually start moving the king. So the point is that Nakamura echoed was to leave the knight here. Actually restricts the king kind of usefully, and also potentially, you know, the knight f6 is going to be useful. But he could also just bring his king over, and the 2-to-1 is kind of, there seems to be enough prophylaxis against moving the pawns here. Although the knight looks kind of beautiful on e5, I think this white shouldn't be losing this for sure. So, but in the game we see bishop c2, and yeah, inviting complications with knight takes b2. If knight takes b2, white actually has some play like this, so rook a6, and then here, and apparently this is about equal, this position. It seems as though it's complex, but there's other stuff going on here, like this pin here. So b3, there's tactics here. So Magnus actually didn't go for that pawn. He actually left this knight, quite lovely knight actually, on e5. So although he's a pawn down, he's blockading one of white's pawns, the e pawn. So it looks as though it's just a 2-to-1 pawn majority really. And okay, white plays rook a6, hitting d6. That's actually just humbly protected. Knight g3. This might be the wrong plan. Maybe it's better to leave the knight here. If white just uses the king to make sure the king can help. The rook's in a reasonable place at the moment. I'm not sure how black would make progress on king g1. Say b4. Okay, let's go with rook b1. And now it's not entirely sure. Okay, hitting the rook. If white just tries to sit still like this with knight on h5, it does seem hard to see how these pawns are doing anything. But in the game, it's just a little bit strange that after knight g3, seduced by this kind of maneuver, it comes with a big downside, this maneuver, even though it looks entirely illogical to come to that d4 square, and entirely attractive to sort of mirror this knight a little bit. There's a little bit of a downside here. Rook b8 immediately hits the rook, so the rook moves, and now we see b4. The pawn seems to be in motion here a bit more aggressively. Knight e2, so that looks to be carrying on the plan. But now there's the b5 square is actually useful for this bishop to come to this diagonal. This is annoying statistically that it's rewarded the bishop. If it was given another 2 moves for c3, that would be end of game. Bishop d7, so coming to b5 and c3 looks dangerous. We see Naka having to play very precisely here now, and he didn't play precisely, so he's actually going to be worse off, even though he's a pawn down. Sorry, even though Naka's a pawn up, he needs to play precisely, and the engine suggests that okay, he should be okay even with knight d4 actually. b3, bishop b1. If black tries to get this file, it looks dangerous, these pawns, but might be enough just to hold the position here. This sort of position could be enough for white just to hold, even though the bishop looks silly. If the king is actually doing something. okay, it looks as though, yeah, white should be able to draw this. At least it looks equal from an engine point of view. Absolutely 0-0. But let's go back. We see this rook fa1. I think here position starts slipping a little bit from white. Bishop b5 now, friends. c3. So clearly an obvious threat to use the pawn majority. If knight d4 here, then b3, and this is actually quite annoying for c3. Now, a simple example of this is taking here as a disaster now because of b2 and bishop d3. Ouch. Here you might think, well, bishop c2 we can take here, and it's starting to be really horrible for white. These pawns are just an absolute menace. There's too much pressure. The knight's in into a place here. There's too much pressure. Black's gonna be crashing through. So, okay, knight d4, b3 looks actually really dangerous with c3 on the cards. White has to play precisely. He played actually, I mean, a move like rook b1, it's really passive. c3 hitting the knight, knight d4, bishop d3 now. You see this pawn majority is torturing white. If takes here, then actually just taking here, and the back row is also a weakness now, as well as this dangerous pass pawn. So say takes like this. This is horrible for white. Well, it's not that pleasant. So yeah, there's these ramifications of this pawn majority basically, and now showing evidently. So Naka actually, after bishop b5, played h3, at least sorting out his back row issues. But now rook dc8, so c3 is evidently on the cards to hit the knight. Knight d4 here now. Again, this b3 is nasty. You know, if bishop b1, c3, and again we get a really nasty position with these pawns. In fact, c takes b2 here is embarrassing. That's going to be better for black. So yeah, white actually played now king h2, so he's actually going to be losing the b2 pawn. That's the decision, to lose the b2 pawn just right there. What does he do here though? If not knight d4, which looks logical, if knight f4, then b3 and c3, and if takes, this pass pawn is just so dangerous. So b2 coming up, it's horrible. So yeah, king h2 was played. Now Magnus plays c3, and black is just doing very well here. Knight d4, c takes, he's just won a pawn. Rook b1, now rook c4, trying to get rid of that knight to get a rook to the 7th. Black's actually increasing his advantage now with this rook on the 7th. Doesn't really matter about knight takes d6 here. Knight d4 was played. If knight takes d6, this gives black a chance to play rook d8 to get a tempo for knight f3 check, and then knight d2, winning the exchange. Pretty unpleasant stuff. And after that, it's still the pass pawn, so white's never going to get a chance for compensation. So the knight actually goes to d4. We see rook d2. Here though, apparently the engines are crying out for a different idea, to play b3 with like +3 or more, or winning. The engines think b3 is totally winning here, full stop. Both players didn't really know why, say after knight c6. The thing is, the rook doesn't have to move here at all. Knight f3 check, knight d2 looks pretty terminal. If takes, rook a2, and this pawn is just queening, assisted by the knight. Yeah, so b3 looks to be immediately like winning here technically. You might think, well, hang on, what about king g3, getting out of knight f3, knight c4 then, with the idea of knight d2 is pretty menacing, or knight a3 or something. Not knight a3, just pardon me. In this position, protecting b2, rook c1. Yeah, it just seems this knight is a killer knight. If it's either going here or here, protecting the pawn from there would allow rook b1. Yeah, it's horrible. So, but anyway, Magnus didn't play b3 here. It just seems completely winning. He played rook d2. Still black's in the driving seat. Where does knight actually want to go here? We see knight c6. Magnus doesn't want to take that to give white a pass pawn. I think it's sort of blow his advantage significantly. Go back to equal here. No, he just plays rook e8 with the idea of moving the knight and then coming through here, the centre. And he has the perk of the g2 pawn there. Rook a4, the knight comes to protect here, and there's a nice pin defence if knight takes, as well as what was played actually. The pin defence, you have to bear in mind there's rook a8 check, so Magnus is seeing that knight d3 is okay anyway here, which is brilliant. It is actually one of the best moves. Rook a4, knight d3 from the engine perspective is the best move. So we'll see now, knight takes b4. So the idea is not rook takes e4, but something else. Very, very strong move indeed. So at move 45, just to show you, rook takes e4, the check leaves white equal. Apparently, knight takes and there's nothing. End of advantage. No, the idea here. So Magnus at the moment is a pawn down in this position, but after knight f2, that is a really dangerous pass pawn. Knight takes e4 will happen, and white's in big trouble in this position. If, say, e5 as an example, then either knight d1 or even just rook takes e5. With knight d1 to follow, then there's knight c3 after that, so that pass pawn will be celebrated. Okay, so what does white actually do here? He's actually technically a lot worse, like -2 to black. He tries rook a2, one of the better moves in the circumstance. Knight d1 now is played. And the cruel thing is that this knight can zip in and take a rook and protect this rook at the same time. That's the really cruel thing about this position. Just to show that as an example, if knight c6, actually, let's be careful what I say here. I don't think this actually works. No, rook bb2 is okay, hitting the rook there. That will leave white escaping. No, the knight should be left here. Rook takes e4 instead. And then protect, and then knight c3. Just do it calmly. Okay, so knight d1. Naka's in a bad state here. He goes the exchange down now. So black is just going to take on e4. That's the main thing. So he sacrifices the exchange to get rid of that pawn. So the exchange down for one pawn. But he's hitting the knight already, and there's already some dangers emerging for his king as well. Knight c6, king g7 extinguishing f6 for the moment. That's not a dangerous attacking pawn, but it's actually given here as a sacrifice. It's a terrible position. d5 is hanging That's 1 point. And if rook b5, then rook e2, you can go for the king here and start lining up for g2. So f6 is played by Necker. It's lost. Check. Plays knight d8. Doesn't really do anything after rook e8. It's not even threatening to win f7 because of this horrible pin. Necker resigns here. If knight takes f7, pardon me, there's a little trick with the pin actually, which makes it not the best move, but still better for black. The little trick is if rook f8, knight e5 check, but still black would be better there. But much stronger than that is cutting the knight off with rook takes d5. So it leaves rook f8. So, pardon me, leaves not rook f8, king g7, and then rook f8. The knight's not actually going anywhere; it's just stuck there. So king g7 first, then rook f8. Yeah. So after rook e8, actually Necker didn't even test that Magnus was going to play rook takes d5 here after knight takes f7. He actually resigned. But yeah, knight takes f7, rook takes d5. It's all over. There's nothing. The knight's kind of stranded. So h4, king g7. The knight's going to be exterminated with rook f8. Okay, so he kind of resigned after that. He didn't even want to play this because, well, black is a pawn up and the exchange up. So, yeah, very, very interesting game. It seems Magnus played the kind of, in my view, played the modern Benoni style without the fianchetto, having the classic pawn majority, and it didn't really matter in that sort of position to be a pawn down over here if he's got a blockade in the centre. It seems his pawn majority, he was creating all the threats and the coordination of his pieces. Try and make use of these dangerous pawns. Very, very interesting game. I think that makes it 10-0 to Magnus on classical games. It's unbelievable, but Magnus is a tough opponent, the world champion. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.